As we continue to look at the Bible through the lens of archaeology, we last saw the evidence from Moses and Mount Sinai. So next we will explore the evidence for Joshua and the people of Israel in the Promised Land. The next site of interest is near Nablus in Samaria. This would have been the key geographical region in the history of Israel from the time of Joshua to the time of David, as this was also the area where Israel's capital was located until David's conquest of Jerusalem. We will begin by looking at an archaeological site on a mountain just above Nablus, and that mountain is called Mount Ebal. In 1980, Professor Adam Zertal, an archaeologist from the University of Haifa, found a large stone structure while surveying Mount Ebal. When excavated, he discovered an altar built entirely of large, unhewn stones. A thick layer of ash and bone was also found and analyzed, and the layer contained the bones of over 900 animals, including goats, sheep, cattle, and deer. The animals were all estimated to be young males around 1 year old. Please note that this was all clearly in accordance to the Levitical requirements and commands passed on by Moses. At the same site, two remarkable Egyptian signet rings were found. One contained the name of Thutmoses III from the Ramses II time period, which many scholars believe is the pharaoh from around the time of the Exodus. So why are all these facts about this altar significant? In Deuteronomy, Moses tells the people that when they enter the land that God gives them, they must build an altar of uncut stones on Mount Ebal and sacrifice burnt offerings to God. And in Joshua chapter 8, we read that Joshua obeyed all that the Lord told him to do through Moses. When Professor Zertal first began to study this site on Mount Ebal, he did not believe that the Bible was accurate or trustworthy at all, and he was specifically trained to ignore and disregard the Bible. But now I will let him describe in his own words his experience.
And when we came here, I was sure that this could not be the altar because I was educated in Tel Aviv University, which is the center of anti-biblical philosophy. I was educated there is no altar. Why should I search for the altar? And that was very good because I didn't have any preconception. All over the time, the 8 years that we have been excavating here, I had all the arguments against being the altar. And only when I didn't have any choice left, became the conclusion that this is the altar. When we came here, now you see here the altar is the big building there. That's the original altar from the time of Joshua and Moses. And you can see that it is located inside the big enclosure. This is map of the enclosure. That's the altar. It's turned. And you can see that we are standing in a very big valley where you can stand thousands and thousands that can take part in all the ceremonies. Now it's a good example because you can imagine that those people are from the time of Joshua. So you can see how well you see what's going on there and how well you hear. I always send somebody, a volunteer there to run and give not even a shout, just pray. You can hear it. The acoustic is very, very good here. So, all over the valley and this slope, you can stand many people that will participate in the ceremony. You have to remember that we are talking about the ceremony of the beginning somebody has a Bible.
Yep. In English?
I think
It can be in Hebrew, but I doubt if you.
you're right.
Is Deuteronomy 27 from 1 to 10. What we found here basically is a a burnt offering altar, the only one that is known. That's the reconstruction. You will see it now with your beloved guide. And you can see in yellow, this is the altar itself. Here you put fire, and this is a ramp. You know why a ramp and not stairs?
So you can't see out the clothes, you don't be your nakedness.
Exactly. You know by heart everything. And here you have that's surround or sovev, and these are the two courtyards. There are many other points, but I want to emphasize, I think one of the most important finds are two seals or scarabs of Ramses II. Ramses II, the greatest pharaoh in the history of Egypt. Ramses II ruled Egypt all over the 13th century, and he was supposed to be the pharaoh of Exodus, but there's never been archaeological proof for it. We found two seals of him, see, one and another one, that were produced in the last third of his rule, which fits very well the dating of the Exodus. And one of the two seals was made in Egypt, produced in Egypt, because the identical seal was found in Saqqara near Cairo. So it gives us a good indication for the Exodus. It's extremely important because this is the first station that they should have come after crossing the Jordan. Right? The last point, I want to tell you something, is Mount Gerizim. In Joshua, you've read it, in Joshua chapter 8, verse 33, the people are standing from both sides of the altar, half looking to Mount Gerizim and half looking to Mount Ebal. You remember that? The meaning is, why are you smiling?
I'm just happy. This is wonderful. I love it.
Thank you very much. Oh, you make me smile as well. And the meaning is that if you stand on the altar, you should see both summits of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And the fact is, you cannot see from here the summit of Mount Gerizim of the Samaritans.
Right.
I believe that the Samaritans took the name Mount Gerizim from the mountain of Moses here to their new mine.
I have a question. So after this was all uncovered, what did your university do with you then? Because you proved the Bible.
Oh, that's a very, it's under the belt. I was frozen. My career was frozen for several years. The committee, biblical archaeology, most of the people there were from Egypt. And I just cite Professor Larry Steger. You don't know the name. He's the chair of biblical archaeology in Harvard University. A personage. He wrote, if Adam Zertal is right, there was an altar on Mount Ebal, we biblical scholars should all go back to kindergarten. He wrote it.
Amen.
Now, since not everybody likes to go back to kindergarten, so the other choice is to fight Adam Zertal and to freeze him and That's not. But with the help of God, I hope it's open. Since I have published 1990, 2 years ago, the preliminary report in English of the altar of the excavations, and it's about more than 100 pages with the main data. Nobody ever has debated with me, discussed against me by writing. And the reason is very clear. If you don't have argument against it, but you cannot support, because if you support, you shoot in your leg or in your head. So you say nothing, you ignore. The tactics now is to ignore. Therefore, here I come to you. Your job now is to tell everybody about this discovery, because they want to ignore the whole thing, and so I come to the common people, the lay people, to say, tell everybody what you've seen.
Joshua led these sacrifices at Mount Ebal sometime around 1406 BC. In the same area near Nablus, another major biblical event is recorded, the conquering of Jericho. In Joshua chapter 6, we read that Joshua obeyed all that the Lord told him to do, and the walls of Jericho fell flat so that the people could run up into the city and capture it. In this video, we will see if there is any archaeological evidence for the biblical account of Jericho.
This is the ancient site of Jericho. Jericho is where the Bible says the walls came tumbling down. In the 1930s, archaeologist John Garstang dug here, followed by the work of his colleague Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Garstang concluded that the archaeological evidence he found here matched the biblical account. But Kenyon said no. She said that at the time the Bible says the Israelites attacked Jericho, there was neither a city nor even walls here at the time.
There's no archaeological evidence in Jericho.
The wall is Middle Bronze Age and it has nothing to do with the Late Bronze Age. It has nothing to do with the coming of the Israelites.
If you go to Jericho, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Problem, there's no wall.
Who established that dating for Jericho? Was it
Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated there.
Okay.
What you have to do is look at the evidence, analyze the evidence, and come to your conclusion based on the evidence, not what an authority figure says, not what the majority opinion is. You have to just put that out of your mind and just look at the evidence and come to your conclusion based on what the evidence tells you.
So is the story of the walls falling down at Jericho history or myth? See for yourselves here on Expedition Bible. We are here at the Tel Aviv airport, and we are here to pick up Dr. Peter Parr. That's the sign. Professor Peter Parr agreed to help us better understand Jericho by returning to the site he helped excavate over 50 years earlier.
My name is Peter Parr. 50 years ago I worked with Kathleen Kenyon on the Jericho excavations. She was someone I admired and she was my boss. But we got on well.
So we're here at the airport in Tel Aviv. We're picking up Dr. Bryant Wood. Also joining us is Dr. Bryant Wood, who is in the process of publishing his analysis of the pottery from both Garstang and Kenyon's digs at Jericho.
I completed my doctoral studies, and the subject of my dissertation was Canaanite pottery of the late Bronze Age. Well, you might say, that sounds pretty boring. What would Canaanite pottery of the late Bronze Age have to do with the Bible? Well, it turns out that we have to use pottery for dating. And dating is crucial for correlating what you're finding in an archaeological excavation with history.
These two archaeologists, Dr. Parr and Dr. Wood, come from radically different viewpoints.
I'm religious of the belief, of the faith. I don't happen to be very religious.
Yes, I would believe what the Bible says, take it literally.
Despite their differences, let's begin with what these archaeologists do agree about regarding Jericho. So, really among scholars there isn't any debate on that this actually is the site of Jericho.
No.
Well, there's no question but what this is Jericho. Nobody disputes that at all. So this is the site that the Bible is telling us about.
I don't think there's any, no one as far as I know has ever argued that this is not biblical Jericho.
The thing to understand about Jericho is that it is a tell. Behind me here is what archaeologists today call a tell. Today, through excavation, they know this is where people lived, this is where ancient cities were. So, I mean, to help us understand a tell, I mean, could you kind of look at it as a cake?
A layer cake.
A layered cake.
Yes, many, many layers.
I think of a nice jam sponge cake that my wife makes. Very nice.
So we are making a cake to better understand a tell, and just like a tell, a cake is made up of different layers. And a city would be abandoned or destroyed, and then they would come onto the ruins and they would build another city over the top, and then another one over a long period of time. Different cities would be built on top of each other until you have these unnatural looking hills like this, today called a tell. This is an example of one that has never been excavated.
And when you begin to dig into this tell, you go down through it layer by layer as you get down to the earlier and earlier and earlier cultures.
Just as we can now cut open our cake to expose the inner structure of our cake, so archaeologists dig into a tell to expose the inner structure of the layer system within a tell.
That's a very good description, except archaeology is not a piece of cake. It's a lot of hard work. As we excavate the material from the tell, however, it is silent. Very rarely will you find a written document that's going to tell you who lived here, when they lived here, why they abandoned their city, why their city was destroyed.
Archaeologists can't answer that sort of question. We see what's happened, but the why it happened is sometimes very difficult.
So you have to depend on written text, historical records, to interpret what you're digging up in that tell.
Dr. Randall Price excavates at Qumran, across from cave number 4, where many ancient fragments of Old Testament scrolls were found. These 2,200-year-old texts that were discovered here in cave number 4 were hand-copied from even earlier manuscripts, and they are our best source for what happened at Jericho in the ancient past. So this is cave number 4.
This is cave number 4. Yeah, right out of this very section came sections of the book of Joshua, the sections we have from Qumran.
And so how important do you think it is to use the biblical text and the archaeology that's been done at Jericho to interpret what's been found there?
Well, it's extremely important because, one, it's an historical document.
Really, the only ancient text that you have to work with for here is the biblical text, right?
Biblical text, yes, yes.
We have no other references to Jericho outside the Bible.
And no other Old Testament book has more historical information about Jericho than the book of Joshua. In regards to Jericho, it is important for us to understand that the book of Joshua is our only voice from the ancient past that speaks of what happened there over 3,000 years ago.
The Bible's an ancient text, and the book of Joshua is an ancient text, and so we know the story in the book of Joshua is an ancient account. So when the archaeologists excavated at Jericho, did they find evidence that matched that text or not?
In 1907, a German team began the first major excavation work at Jericho.
They were able to trace around the outside perimeter of the tell the lower retaining wall that holds in place the earthen embankment around the tell.
This short section of stone wall can still be seen at Tel Jericho today. But what was the purpose of a retaining wall like this one?
When I pour this bucket of dirt out, it spreads out across a flat ground. However, if I make a circle of stones and I pour the bucket of dirt into it, then the dirt is retained by the stone wall surrounding it.
This is the stone retaining wall which held in place the earthen embankment that surrounded the city, and on top of the stone retaining wall was the mud brick wall.
On top of this stone foundational retaining wall, there was another wall, the city wall, which was made out of mud bricks.
The three teams that dug Jericho were the German team from 1907 to 1909, John Garstang in the 1930s and Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Using the excavation reports from these three digs, we were able to reconstruct what the city of Jericho would have looked like in the time of Joshua. Both the stone wall and the mud brick wall on top of it made up the outer wall that surrounded the city. Further up the embankment was another mud brick wall.
And so as the Israelites were marching on the outside here where we are, this is what they were looking at. This stone facing wall, this big high mud brick wall, the embankment, another mud brick wall up on top. And so as they marched around, they must have been thinking, how are we going to capture this city? Because it's so strongly fortified.
Referring to our ancient text, Joshua 6:20 says that on the seventh day, at the sound of the trumpets, the wall collapsed.
And the Bible is very specific in how it describes that event. The Hebrew wording there is the walls takatha, fell beneath themselves. And on the seventh trip around, we're told in the Bible, the mud brick wall collapsed and it fell outward and down to the base of the stone retaining wall. And when the archaeologists dug in this area, they found this pile of mud bricks all the way along the retaining wall.
So where I am right now is where the pile of red bricks were found.
That's correct.
The Germans, Garstang and Kenyon, all found these piles of collapsed mud bricks while excavating at the base of the stone retaining wall.
Then she shows that she dug down the side of that the outside of that revetment wall, and then there were reddish collapsed bricks that she said came from the top of that stone wall.
Yes. Which is another reason to suppose that these weren't, there were walls on top. They're not in situ, but the collapsed brick has come down. Yes. If you have a brick wall sitting on top of a stone revetment and it falls over, where else can the bricks go? They've got to go to the bottom.
And so with that pile of bricks, what does that what does that tell us? Does that tell us that there was a destruction of the wall?
Certainly. It certainly is evidence of that destruction.
These fallen bricks from the city wall can be seen in this diagram from Kenyon's excavation report. In her write-up, she makes it clear that it was not the stone retaining wall that fell, but rather the mud brick wall that once stood on top of it.
And so she writes that up in her report, that here we have a collapsed city wall. And here's the evidence for it.
The archaeological understanding of how the walls of Jericho fell matches well with the ancient description of the wall falling beneath itself.
This find of a collapsed city wall found here at Jericho is unique in archaeology. At no other site have we found evidence for a city wall that has fallen down.
Yes, there were remains of the mud brick that had fallen down. I mean, that wall came tumbling down.
So the Bible says that the wall came tumbling down. The archaeologists then came and dug Jericho, and what did they find? They found a collapsed city wall. This fits perfectly with the description from the ancient text.
And when you have that text, and you have the archaeology, and you can fit them together, then you have the evidence from both sides, the literary evidence and the actual physical evidence from what the Bible is talking about.
Another interesting detail regarding the walls of Jericho is found in Joshua 6:20. It says that after the walls collapsed, the Israelites went up into the city. Kenyon's excavation report shows that the pile of fallen mud bricks could have been used as a ramp by the charging Israelites.
Because that would be a problem, wouldn't it? I mean, if the soldiers were charging, there's a mud brick wall up there. Even with that mud brick wall gone, I mean, what are they supposed to do? I mean, climb up the wall to attack. So what Kenyon's report says is that mud brick wall collapsed off of this foundation, and it went all the way up to the top of the rim there, and it formed a ramp like this so that when the charging army would come, they could have run up into the city to attack it.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what the Bible says. Each man went before him straight up into the city, and they could do that by just climbing up over that pile of collapsed mud bricks, up over the top of the stone retaining wall, up the embankment, and into the city.
Joshua 6:24 then tells us that the Israelites burned the whole city and everything in it. To understand what a burned city would look like in Etel, let's return for a moment to our cake analogy. This chocolate layer represents a city that was destroyed by fire. Ooh! A burned layer stands out from the other layers of a cake, just as a burned city stands out when Etel is excavated.
Now, just as we can remove a slice from a cake to expose the inner structure of the cake, the same thing is true for Etel. As this trench was dug, this burn layer that you see right here was exposed.
When Kathleen Kenyon came in the 1950s, she opened up actually 5 squares in this area to kind of check Garstang's findings to see if she came up with the same results he found, because he found evidence for a massive destruction by fire, and he of course equated that to the biblical account, because the Bible says the Israelites charged up into the city and then they set it on fire. So she opened up these squares, and she found exactly the same sequence that Garstang had found. Vast destruction layer, about 3 feet thick of destruction debris, ash, collapsed roof timbers, and all kinds of things.
Now in this burn layer, both Garstang and Kenyon found room after room of large storage jars that were full of grain, and all of it was burned.
Domestic structures had been violently destroyed. There were storage jars full of grain that had all been burnt.
Yes, the burnt wheat found there at Jericho is very important because it ties in with our biblical story.
Joshua 3:15 tells us that when the Israelites crossed the Jordan, it was at flood stage because it was during harvest time. And we see in Joshua 5:10 that after crossing the Jordan River, the Israelites celebrated the Passover.
It tells us in the Bible, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, it was at flood stage because it was harvest time. Well, in the southern Jordan Valley, harvest time is in the spring of the year.
Would you agree with some of Wood's arguments as far as the wheat that was found there, that it at least tells us some basic information as far as what time of year the city was destroyed?
Yes, his assumptions, I think, are reasonable. Those containers, those pots were full of grain, therefore they must have been filled fairly soon after the harvest.
We know that the Israelites came into the land and attacked Jericho in the spring of the year after Passover. And that's the same time of year as it is right now in Israel. All over Israel they're celebrating Passover, and the people are bringing the wheat harvest in from the fields. And so we know both agriculturally and archaeologically that Jericho was attacked after the wheat harvest had been taken in.
Now this is a very unusual find because grain was valuable. Why would you leave it to be burned up?
Joshua 6:18 tells us that while destroying Jericho, the Israelites were commanded to keep away from the devoted things.
Just the very fact that the grain was left to be destroyed in the fire tells us also that the Israelites obeyed God's command not to plunder the city. They're simply to offer up Jericho as an offering to the Lord as the first fruits of the promised land.
The basic sequence of events found in the Bible describing Jericho match the layer sequence the archaeologists found in the Tell.
And in fact, Kathleen Kenyon introduced what we call the stratigraphic method of excavation here at Jericho, where you just peel down the layers, layer by layer, and you, in particular, analyze the vertical sides of the trench or the square that you're digging, and you draw it, you photograph it, because in the vertical trench you have a sequence of the events that have taken place as they're preserved in the earth layers. And she said the evidence here shows that the walls collapsed first, the earthquake happened first, and then the fire happened. That's exactly what the Bible says. The walls came down as the Israelites were marching around that seventh day. They went up into the city, then they set it on fire. Earthquake, fire. And she said, that's the sequence I have found here.
In Joshua 6:26, Joshua said, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild this city Jericho."
On top of that destruction was this erosional layer.
After the destruction, you get material rolling down the hillside.
And we can account that to the fact that the city was abandoned for some period of time. And
then a period when Jericho was not settled. It was abandoned, it was deserted.
If you recall in the biblical story, Joshua pronounced a curse on Jericho, on anybody that would rebuild a city. There would be a curse on that person.
The ancient text tells us that the walls collapsed, that the city was burned and afterwards laid abandoned. When archaeologists dug at Jericho, they found that the wall had collapsed. The city had been burned, and it had lain abandoned for quite some time.
That's the sequence in the Bible. That's the sequence Kathleen Kenyon discovered in her excavations.
So if the archaeological evidence found here matches so well with the biblical account, then what's the problem? Why is there such a debate among scholars today about this site of Jericho?
This obvious destruction of the city, which evidence Garstang found, evidence Kenyon found. The debate is over the date of that.
So does the Bible in fact give us a date for the time of Joshua's destruction of Jericho?
According to biblical chronology, the conquest happened around 1400 BC.
Yeah, I mean, we have 1 Kings 6, which talks about in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, and that's about 967 BC. It says it was 480 years after the time of the conquest by Joshua, the entrance into the land. So if you add those numbers together, you come to what we would consider an early date, around 1446 BC.
So 1446, and then you got to take the 40 years out for the wandering in the wilderness, and so you come to around 1406?
Yeah, for the time of Joshua's conquest.
Historically, we know that Solomon began building the temple in 966 BC. 1 Kings 6:1 tells us that this was 480 years after the Israelites had come out of Egypt. When we add 480 to 966, we come to 1446 BC. And since we know that the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years, we have to subtract that from 1446 BC, bringing us to 1406, the biblical date for the conquest. After analyzing the pottery, Garstang dated the destruction of Jericho to around 1400 BC in agreement with the Bible. But Kenyon disagreed, dating the city's destruction 150 years earlier to around 1550 BC. So the debate is over when the city was destroyed. The Bible says it was around 1400 BC. Kathleen Kenyon said it was around 1550 BC. This 150-year discrepancy has huge implications. It would mean that when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, there would have been no city of Jericho for them to destroy. It would also mean that the writers of the biblical account would have fabricated the story of Joshua and the great battle of Jericho.
She claimed quite clearly, on the basis of the pottery, dated to about 1550.
I'm just saying John Garstang had it right, Kathleen Kenyon had it wrong.
When you look over at the bulk over here and you see this rim of this pot, are you looking at that and seeing pottery from the time of Joshua?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, those storage jars are late bronze 1, the same thing that Garstang had found, and that carries over to all the other pots, cooking pots, storage jars, and bowls, and so on. Yes.
So what is the deal with pottery anyway? And how is it used to date the events in a tell? Well, think of it this way. Just like cars change in style over time, so did ancient pottery. So when archaeologists study pottery they excavate in a layer, they can estimate a date for the event that formed that layer. Pottery from different sites can then be compared with each other. These are called parallels.
Yes, in order to make my case for the dating of the destruction of Jericho, I have to show beyond doubt that the pottery in that destruction level dates to the end of the 15th century BC. And the only way I can do that in a credible fashion is to use parallels from other sites where scholars have already said this pottery dates to the end of the 15th century BC. And so it's not my word only. It's the word of all the other scholars who have excavated similar material, came to independent conclusions, and I'm merely using their results and feeding it into my analysis and saying, yes, based on all this information, all this data we have from all these places, I can safely date this destruction to the end of the 15th century BC. Kenyon had dated that destruction 150 years earlier. How could she be so far wrong? She was a very good field archaeologist, but in her dating here, she made a critical error. She based her date on what she didn't find, which is always dangerous, an argument from silence. She, in this destruction layer, did not find a type of imported pottery from Cyprus, which was relatively common in that time period, but it's easily distinguished, easily dated. And so she was looking for that kind of pottery to date her destruction level. She never paid any attention to the local Canaanite pottery, which was there in abundance. That's what Garstang used from his area over to the south, that local Canaanite pottery. He dated it based on that. She didn't pay any attention to that. She was looking for this imported Cypriot ware. She didn't find it. She said, must be nobody was living here. Otherwise there would be Cypriot pottery from the late Bronze I period. And so she said it must have been destroyed before.
Now, even though Kathleen Kenyon never did find this particular kind of pottery that was imported from Cyprus, John Garstang, who dug before her, did find an imitation of this same kind of Cypriot ware. And what an imitation is that it is a copy that uses the real type of pottery. And therefore, they both date to the same time period, around 1400 BC.
I have studied all of the pottery that she excavated out of this destruction level. I've studied all of Garstang's pottery, and it's very clear that that destruction happened at the end of late Bronze I, around 1400 BC.
Well, I think the strongest part of the argument was the question of pottery, where he said that the pottery that was found from the destruction, associated with the destruction, in view of the parallels he found at other sites, was to be dated close to 1400 and 1550.
When we do an in-depth analysis of the finds from Jericho, we soon discover that the reason for the discrepancy is not because the Bible's wrong, but because of a misinterpretation of the archaeological evidence.
I do tend, I suppose, to support Kenyon's interpretation, but at the same time, some of the other critics have studied the material in greater depth.
In this case, Kathleen Kenyon misdated the destruction of Jericho.
So my mind is somewhat still open on the question of the date of that destruction.
And once we analyze the material from the destruction level, we see she was wrong. The real date is around 1400 BC, the biblical time of the conquest.
I'm a neutral. I do not know whether Jericho was invaded and attacked by Joshua. I tend to accept that there was a tradition, this is true, there is a tradition, obviously in the Old Testament, and I see no reason to believe that something like that didn't happen.
If there is a conflict between an ancient text and modern scholarship, and you had to go with one or the other because they were in opposition to each other, which one would you see as the most reliable source, the modern scholars or the ancient text?
Well, I think we have to go with the folks who wrote the text way back in antiquity. They were closer to the events than we are today. So when the archaeologists excavated at Jericho, did they find evidence that matched that text or not? Well, yes, they did. They found that it was fortified, as the Bible says. We found that the walls fell down, as the Bible describes. This happened at harvest time, as the Bible describes. The city was burned, as the Bible described. You would not know those details. It had to be somebody who was there and witnessed these events and recorded it at the time. An eyewitness account. That's the only answer. There's no other answer. So I think we have to take the Bible literally and believe that this really happened. This is real history, and those walls came down exactly as described.
The battle for Jericho is one of the most memorable stories in the Bible. And since the Bible is our only ancient account for Jericho, and since the details in the text match so well with the archaeological evidence found here, then the best conclusion that we can draw is that at the time of Joshua's conquest, the walls of Jericho really did come tumbling down.
Joshua led the conquest of Jericho sometime around 1406 BC. It is believed that Joshua lived until 1358 BC.